Yes. This is episode number 13 of the Midlife Crisis podcast. I'm here at Chop Sports Studios with Dave Sergio with the producing. Congratulations to Dave. He started the what is it called? Fight Factory. So you got a lot of exciting things coming up. So make sure you follow them on their social media. I reached out to a couple guests with the basketball season, especially in the high school basketball season in New Jersey, coming to a close. A lot of coaches, a lot of reporters are tied up right now. So it was announced a couple weeks ago that New Jersey, our own MetLife Stadium, would get the bid to host the final game in the World Cup of 2026. Last time the U.S. hosted the World Cup was 1994, and it was a success. It had a lot of a lot of success, a lot of different teams, very popular, and also started the Major League Soccer. Started in 1996. Back in the early 70s, I always heard about the Cosmos, about some of these other teams that were established in the North American Soccer League, and players like Pele, Franz Beckenbauer, Giorgio Canaglia, George Best, and also a homegrown talent like Bobby Rigby came in and played for the for NALS. You also had teams like the Chicago Sting, Fort Lauderdale Strikers, Kansas City Spurs. So this was all started by some of the NFL ownership who saw back in 1966 when the World Cup was televised, first televised soccer game in the U.S. Lamar Hunt, Joe Robbie, and Jack Kent Cooke looked at this as an opportunity, and also looked at this as maybe they could start something here. They 1967 they had two leagues. The NALS was started in 1968, very popular, but then also by 1984 it kind of fell off a cliff. The U.S. Put in a bid with FIFA to have the World Cup back in 1994, and they ended up getting it, and it's very successful. The MLS have seen some, most recently Messi playing for the Miami club. You also had Wayne Rooney, Valderrama from Colombia, Thierry Henry, and David Beckham coming and playing for MLS. So viewership has been coming up. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about what happened in MLS, what lessons were learned, and just kind of a preview for the coming up, the 2026 World Cup. So my next guest has written a couple books, wrote a book on the NASL, and also has writing a referee book. It's my pleasure to introduce Ian Plenderleith, coming from Germany. Talk a little bit about, I know FIFA just announced that they were going to be at a Giant Stadium, I guess MetLife Stadium, for the final. So, and I know you wrote a book about the North American Soccer League. So I just wanted to kind of revisit the time when, soccer was kind of king in the 70s. And then, for me growing up, it was like 1984. It just kind of fell off a shelf. All of a sudden, you heard about the Cosmos selling out then Giant Stadium, and it just kind of fell off a cliff. And then all of a sudden, they got the World Cup in '94. So it was like a period there that football or American soccer was kind of off the map. But just if you could just talk a little bit about, like, I guess in 1966, I guess they had the first live broadcast, and it was the last time you really think about it, England won the World Cup back in 1966. So and then after that, they decided to start a professional league. Some of the people saw that there was a market here. So I know you wrote the one book about the NASL. So you just talk a little bit about soccer in America.
Yes, it was my book, Rock and Roll Soccer, as inspired by my own youth in the 1970s, where I experienced American soccer very much from afar growing up in England. And but it was this weird, fascinating world of plastic pitches and strange uniforms and cheerleaders, and also for the very first time you had this agglomeration of star names appearing in one league, which at the time was extremely unusual. I remember in 1978 or 9, after the Argentina World Cup, 2 Argentine players came to play for Tottenham Hotspur, and that was an absolute sensation that 2 players from South America came to play in the English league. But the North American Soccer League had been pioneering that approach already for years, partly out of necessity, of course, because there weren't enough local players to make it an interesting league for the American audience, but also because they had this vision that this was the way to attract people, was to have as many big names as possible. It was a very logical way of looking at soccer from a marketing point of view. Now, you're right to pinpoint the 1966 World Cup as a turning point for soccer in America, which the story goes that a number of sports owners in the US at that time saw this as a perfect way to fill their stadiums, and they watched the 1966 final. They saw lots of goals. They saw 100,000 people in Wembley Stadium. It seemed like, here's another great sport that we're currently missing out on, and we can have our stadiums looking like that. Unfortunately, it wasn't quite as simple, because there were a few decades of tradition missing, and of course in America it was also a much bigger challenge to create a nationwide coast-to-coast league, purely because of geographical difficulties, and also because, like I said, because this had never been done before. No one had really attempted to have a coast-to-coast league in North America. So it was a bold and adventurous plan that the first business pioneers had of launching soccer in America in a nationwide league, and it almost was a spectacular success after limping along for this first few years. But once the major stars of the world like Pelé and Johan Cruyff, Gerd Müller, Franz Beckenbauer, Carlos Alberto, Chinaglia, and George Best came to the North American Soccer League, then that got a lot of people's attention, and in America and around the world as well. And I think it's part of the theory in my book is that the North American Soccer League had a massive influence on the forming of the Premier League in England and the Champions League in Europe, where soccer authorities and club owners and teams realized that they'd really been failing in their attempts to market the game to a wider audience for a long time, and that there was a lot more cash to be made out of the game than they'd previously realized.
Yeah, well, ironically, you talk about cheerleaders. The producer, where I am in the studio, his mom was a cheerleader for the Cosmos. So I was just doing a preamble for it. So that'd be a new concept for Europeans. But you talk a little bit about Pele. He was like on the tail end of his career, announced his retirement, and then he got paid handsomely by the Cosmos. I guess the contract he signed probably eclipsed whatever he made in the previous 20 years. So what was his impact in coming to the North American Soccer League? And then that also put a lot of fans and a lot of intrigue into soccer itself.
Well, obviously they couldn't have found a bigger name than Pelé, and as you say, he'd retired. Rumor was it that he had made some bad investments, a little bit like Johan Cruyff as well, and that he needed the money. So eventually, although he had retired and vowed that he would only ever play for Santos, his club in Brazil, necessity possibly pushed him towards America. And I'm sure that there was also a certain amount of curiosity at that time of his life to give it a go and see if he could indeed be the harbinger of the global game to its great unconquered market. So you have to give credit to Clive Toye, who was the general manager of the Cosmos at the time, who made strenuous efforts to get Pelé to sign, and was ultimately successful, and turned the Cosmos into a name that still has a lot of recognition now, even decades after they disbanded. And so I think that there's no doubt that Pelé signing, even though his impact on the field was not massive, in terms of his presence and his name was a huge turning point for soccer in North America.
Yeah, because at that time there wasn't really all the TV coverage was regional. There was very few international stars. Like now, you have your phone. You can watch a game anywhere or anytime you want. But I mean, all the markets are kind of regionalized, and you couldn't ask for a bigger market at that time than New York. So I mean, definitely made a splash. And the Cosmos were successful, even more so. Even when the MLS somebody wanted to buy the name, the the gentleman who owned the name didn't really want to relinquish it because of the lore and the tradition of it.
Mhm.
Mm,
Yeah,
so
yeah. But I mean, the Cosmos, of course. I mean, one of the reasons why I wrote my book as well was a little bit to push against the overwhelming narrative of the Cosmos, which kind of dominated all discussions about the North American Soccer League. Now, of course, the Cosmos were the main story; they were the main team. Their story is fascinating, but I was a little bit annoyed by the movie Once in a Lifetime, which I thought sensationalized their role and made it look like they were the be all and end all of the league. And that, although they certainly kickstarted the NASL's glorious era and those few fantastic years in the late 1970s, they weren't by any means the only story happening. And I talked to a lot of the players and who'd been on the Cosmos at the time, who said, well, all this stuff about nightclubs and Mick Jagger and glamour, yeah, partly true, but for them, they were professionals doing a job playing soccer, and they went home to their families, and most of them out on Long Island in the evenings, and they didn't spend a great amount of time hanging out in Studio 51 with Andy Warhol. So I think there's definitely another side to the league where it was a serious soccer league, and it was a serious attempt to establish a sport in the United States. It wasn't all just about having sex and business class on the airplane and that kind of story, which of course we love to be titillated by, but really just makes up about 0.5% of the actual narrative of the whole league, which included a whole host of interesting teams such as the Tampa Bay Rowdies or the Minnesota Kicks, the whole scene in the Pacific Northwest, which endured the post NASL years to come back and in a way almost rescue the Major League Soccer with those fantastic teams with their incredible support that you have up in the Pacific Northwest. So there's a whole ream of fantastic stories about the NASL, which are only even partly told in my book. I mean, I didn't write the ultimate encyclopedia on that. I wrote a story about trying to reflect why the league was significant more than to tell it on a game-by-game basis. But yes, so the league was much more than the Cosmos. I mean, the Cosmos were what made it talked about. They were the team that made it soar to incredible heights very quickly, but they were also in a way the cause of its downfall, because so many teams tried to keep up with them and could not compete with the spending power of Warner Communications. So you had a whole series of owners who thought this was a great new way to make money, and very quickly discovered that soccer in America was actually just a way of burning huge amounts of cash, and they were not going to make any kind of profit out of it at all.
yeah. So even some of the MLS teams, like you talk about Portland and Seattle Sounders and Kansas City, and they had their start in NASL, so they kind of continued. That was kind of where things kind of grew a little bit in the 70s, but they have established teams in MLS and successful teams as well. So. But
yeah, and I think it's also true in other areas. In Canada, for example, even in Florida, in Washington, D.C., where I lived for several years, I played on, I ran a veterans soccer team, an over 35 league, and that was a whole generation of guys that had grown up with the NASL and the Washington Diplomats in the 1970s.
yes.
They all remembered their first exposure to soccer was through the NASL and through the huge number of clinics that the teams would run in schools and in communities to try and get the game out to people and make them understand why it is a fantastic game. And they were very successful in doing that.
Is this the first time you ever heard the word soccer? Like, where the origin is, and we have American football, but where did soccer come in with the NASL, or like, where did
Uh,
the word?
Soccer was actually a very common term in England when I grew up. This
Okay.
snobbery about it, about we Brits have to call it football because the awful Yanks will call it this soccer. It's just not true. And the word soccer derives from association football, which was to distinguish it from rugby football. And in my I have a whole bunch of magazines published in England in the 1970s, which were called Soccer Monthly, and I used to subscribe to that when I was a kid. It only lasted for a couple of years, but soccer was a completely common term. The Guardian used it at the heading of their sports pages for several years without anybody really
Okay.
complaining about it. So I find that debate a little bit pointless.
Okay, because I thought it was like an American term. I didn't really know where it was coming, but just the MLS. Is there a big following in Europe with the MLS? I know, obviously, with Messi coming over to Miami, but the league start.
I have noticed since the start of this new season, and in the last week or two, there has been a lot more coverage of MLS purely because of Messi.
Okay.
I have to be honest. In the last few years, since I moved back to Germany from the US, I have not really followed MLS here, and there's not really much of an outlet. I think there was a channel that showed it very late at night, but I would have had to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning to watch most of the games.
Right.
But I don't think MLS necessarily needs that much attention from Europe right now. I think it's done very well in focusing its attention on getting the US audience on board, which is far more important at this stage of its evolution than to worry about what people in Europe think about it. And I think that's always been a little bit of a problem for MLS, is this kind of inferiority complex compared with the Premier League and La Liga, and in Europe they have all this tradition. I think MLS is better when it just forgets about that and concentrates on doing its own thing, and then maybe and that's paid off in terms of its gradual evolution, and which is very much in contrast to the North American Soccer League, which exploded and then exploded upwards and then exploded back downwards again. And I think MLS has been much more careful and taken the lessons from the NASL to heart, and been much more careful in the way it's moved forward by expanding step by step, choosing its markets and its owners much more carefully. Whereas in the NASL, that was rather indiscriminate. Anybody who came along and had a few bucks to offer could basically get a franchise in Tulsa.
Yeah. Well, and then that seems to be the downfall with the minimum. I guess the salary minimum they had, and also the expansion. It just seemed like there was too many mouths to feed. They couldn't. They couldn't keep up with the bigger markets, and then it just kind of, with the attendance going down. But you think, like, when it first started, and also you had like American college players that ended up playing, and you had so was that any, and now, like, when they became more successful after Pele, you sort of had more teams wanted to be competitive, so they started buying players. Do you think that was part of it, or is that, I'm kind of just overthinking that aspect of one of the reasons why it failed?
Well, yeah, there was a problem in getting US players up to the standard of internationals, obviously, like Cruyff and Carlos Alberto. I think I talked to one or two people who played on the Cosmos, talking about getting yelled at by Carlos Alberto whenever they made a single mistake.
Yeah.
And being held to the kind of high standard was obviously a challenge for some young guy just coming out of college. And if you look at a lot of the soccer press at the time from the 70s, they were desperate for there to be the US equivalent of Pele. Every time there was a young player coming out of college who scored a couple of goals, there was a headline: "Is this our Pele?" Kyle Rote Jr., for example, who played for the Cosmos. So that was very hard for young players to live up to those expectations, and basically being thrown in at the deep end. It was okay in the earlier years of the league, I think, when the standard was not so high, and when a lot of the foreign players came from the English third and fourth divisions. But when the standard went up, it did become difficult. But that's also not to say. I mean, a lot of players did manage to hold their own. The standard was obviously not, not every player was as good as Beckenbauer or as good as Johan Cruyff. So they did have their opportunities to shine and be part of integral parts of the teams. And each team had a minimum number of American players they had to field in order to try and foster the game and foster the development of young US players. And that ended up, I think, with the whole project of the Team America in 1983, which was based in Washington, D.C., which was an attempt to have the U.S. national team play within the North American Soccer League, which also unfortunately failed because a lot of the best U.S. players didn't want to leave the teams they were playing on. They felt that it was better for their development if you, for example, you were playing in the Cosmos alongside a player like Johan Neeskens of Holland. Then you probably thought you would learn more from that than you would by being on Team America.
Yeah, I can see that. So it was 40 years ago, NASL ended up folding, but that kind of started in 1987. USA put the bid in for the '94 World Cup, and they end up getting that big. And I remember at that time it was a success. Like the U.S. World Cup was a successful tournament. You had good crowds, good competition. You had big names, and that kind of sparked the MLS to talk a little bit about the '94 World Cup, the World Cup back in '94.
Yeah, well, in 1994 was a meeting of minds. It was the US suddenly getting the recognition from FIFA that it always craved. During the NASL era, the league and the US Soccer Federation had fallen out with FIFA a lot. Because of the rule changes, the NASL wanted to do its own thing, with not wanting to have games tied, different offside laws, all those kind of innovations that the NASL tried out, but which did not meet with FIFA's approval. Of course, the turning point was the 1984 Olympics, when the soccer tournaments in Los Angeles drew huge crowds. And all of a sudden, FIFA realized, there is a potential massive audience in the US for international soccer. And with the number of teams increased at the tournament 24, FIFA suddenly saw big dollar signs, and they realized well, this is a market that we've ignored so far, because partly down to snobbery, partly down to ignorance, and so when of course. I remember when the tournament venue was announced in Europe in the 1980s, the European soccer establishment, of course, was horrified. This is the same thing we just talked about with this difference between soccer and football. Nobody wanted to believe that the Yanks, who play baseball and that terrible form of rugby, how are they possibly going to put on our fantastic traditional soccer fest? And everybody, I think, I think a lot of people were actually pleasantly surprised what a great tournament that was, and termed not just in standard of football, but how well organized it was, and how when you have these stadiums already there in place, how much more sense it makes to use a market like America for a major tournament than it does to build lots of white elephant stadiums in countries. You have countries like Brazil and South Africa now who are suffering with huge costs running empty stadiums at a loss, or stadiums that are not even used at all, that were just built for 3 or 4 games at one tournament. It absolutely doesn't make any sense at all. So it's easy to see why the 2026 World Cup is coming back to North America, and in Canada and Mexico as well. And I think most people are looking forward to this tournament very much, especially after the controversial venues of Qatar and Russia in the last 2 World Cups.
Very true. Just talk about a little bit the U.S. team. We had the Stars back in '94. They ended up beating Colombia, which is, turned to be devastated to one of the players. But you have a lot of household names that played over in Germany, like Pulisic, and what do you think U.S. chances? Because I mean, in early part of last century, they were successful, and then it just kind of fell off. But you think that that they're climbing that ladder in order of kind of breaking through into
I think it will be fascinating to see how the US team performs at this World Cup, and because you have also a generation of younger players that are establishing themselves very well in European soccer, which has happened before, but I don't think we've had such a lively, exciting crop of players coming through as we have at this point in time before. So US chances of progressing far into the tournament, I would say, are good. I would, ever since I did an interview with the Washington Times probably over 20 years ago now, and I said that the US will never win the World Cup, and I got a lot of flack for that in local soccer circles in DC. So I'm not going to say whether I think the US can win it or won't win it. And in a knockout tournament, anything is possible. And we saw Morocco progress very far in the last World Cup. We've seen Greece win the European Championships in 2004 when nobody was expecting them to. So
Croatia, they're a smaller country. They made it to the final. So it's just
Croatia has an incredible record now, having twice semi-finalists and once in the final for a country that has a population same as Scotland, which is my country, and we've never even got out of the group stage.
So, what else? What teams should you look at? Obviously, the Major League. But what teams do you see, and what players do you think the people that have an interest here in this country? Because I'm talking to you from Germany. That interest, like what players do you think and teams I should probably watch in some of these warm-up matches and some of these tournaments coming up?
Well, you're always going to go back to these old favorites, and I'm going to look at it rather conservatively. I mean, the strongest teams in Europe right now are Spain, France, and England. Germany and Italy are both suffering a bit of a slump.
Okay.
But we're still over 2 years away from the tournament, and a lot can happen in international soccer at that time. You can suddenly have a whole slew of young players come through, and all of a sudden they're making an impact. Germany is hosting the European Championships this summer. Their team has been in crisis now for a few years, despite having a selection of world-class players. They don't seem to be able to get that combination right on the field. They don't seem to be able to pick the 11 players who can make it work together, despite there being a huge amount of talent available. So they're always one to watch out for, but at the moment, nobody in this country is giving them a chance of either winning this summer or in 2026. Obviously, in South America, you're going to be looking at Brazil and Argentina,
sure.
But it will also be. I think what everybody would love to see is some emerging nations coming from Asia and from the African continent as well. Where we've just been a really exciting African Nations Cup where any team could have won it. Ivory Coast, the hosts, ended up winning it after losing 2 of their group games. But there were a whole selection of other teams there that surprised everybody. A lot of the favorites got knocked out early on in the group stage, like I think Morocco and Egypt suffered early exits, and Nigeria, Cameroon as well, I think. But so it's one of the great things about the World Cup is the way that some teams develop and evolve over the course of the tournament. You talked about Croatia before. Nobody usually expects them. They're not in the list of favorites before a tournament, and yet now 3 times in the last 25 years they have progressed to the latter stages and been very close to winning it. And that's one of the fantastic things. I think that's why people really look forward to the tournaments, not just because they're a feast of sport and soccer, but also because they bring so many nations and peoples and cultures together, and usually in a very relaxed atmosphere. And so I'm not 2.5 years ahead of the tournament. I'm not going to give you any firm names.
Well, I guess you got burnt before, so you don't want to. So, but like you even talk about Egypt, like Salah. I mean, you get a couple players around him. I mean, he's played for Liverpool. He's a special player. So it just and coming from Egypt, that's not really, from what I understand, it's not really a hotbed of football talent. So
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that again, if he had the right, if they can find the right players to play around him, then
yeah,
a country like that is always going to have an outside chance. I read a very good article actually in one of the French soccer magazines, which was a preview of the African Nations Cup, where one of the former players appealed for the African nations to stop being afraid of losing. And even cited Morocco's statistics at the World Cup, where they got to the semi-final, and how few chances they created and how few shots they had, saying if African countries would show a bit more enterprise and courage going forward, then maybe they would actually have more chance of winning, rather than being terrified of losing and always playing for the draw or the penalty shootout.
yeah.
So I'm hoping that by the time 2026 comes around, I do think 48 teams is too many for a tournament. I think 32 was the ideal number. I think that's a huge mistake of FIFA. They've over-egged the pudding there, unfortunately. But at the same time, the more nations you have, I guess the greater the chance is of a surprise and shock results.
And then what about the finals being in New York? In '94 was out in Pasadena, California.
Mhm.
Sonny, I mean, I'm coming about 20 miles away, or I don't know, I guess about 30 kilometers from MetLife Stadium, where the finals gonna be held. What's your opinion being in New York? Big market, I guess, a security risk, in this climate. But what's your opinion about having
Well,
the final in
I mean,
MetLife Stadium?
I love the city of New York. I love visiting there. I always love visiting there when I lived in Washington D.C. So it definitely has that thrill of the exotic about it. And I mean, who doesn't want to go to New York City at some
Yeah,
point in their lives? Unfortunately, the final's not actually in New York City; it's in New Jersey,
yeah,
but
yeah,
it's close enough. Let's wipe a sponge over that, as the
yeah.
Germans say. So I think that just certainly makes it more exciting from the public point of view, and I'm sure FIFA will milk that for all it's worth as well. It's nice to have a final somewhere that we can get excited about in terms of the actual location. I think in Qatar, for example, if you were watching the tournament, they had 8 stadiums built, but honestly, you didn't really care which stadium they were playing in. They
Yeah.
were all within a few miles of each other, and in terms, there were some interesting designs of the stadiums. I think if you were there as a fan, but if you were watching on television, they were all much of a muchness, and it was kind of irrelevant in where the games were being played. And one of the great things about the 2026 tournament will be the way it covers the expanse of the North American continent, and the different characters of cities you'll have, which will certainly be talking point when it comes to the schedule.
Yeah. And then just a little bit about um, your new book. It says "Reffing Hell." I know you have a new book out. I think you're promoting. Just talk a little bit about that. The new book, "Reffing Hell." What's that about? Because if in a post-COVID world, I guess a lot of my friends who have kids playing in rec sports, they had a problem with getting referees and all that. I don't know if they're having the same thing over in Europe, where some of the parents get too involved or too vocal, and then just is that what the book's about? I didn't get it.
That's very much what the book's about. I started as a referee in the States when one of my daughters was playing on a travel team, and I needed to train as an assistant referee, and I found myself getting assigned to tournaments. So I trained I enjoyed that very much. So I was trained to be a center referee. And when I came over to Germany 9 years ago, I'd been refereeing by that point for 6 or 7 years in the US and really enjoyed it. So I wanted to continue my way here as a way of being involved in the game, as well as being a coach and a part-time player. I was in for a bit of a shock when I got to Germany, and the culture was a little more intense than it was in the US, where I'd mainly refereed youth games, and 50% of those games had been girls' games, which in general are a lot easier to control. And I found myself refereeing men's games at quite a high level in Germany, and was just astonished at the level of abuse that I got on the field, from the side of the field, from the coaches, from parents in youth games. So as a way of coping with this, my wife got fed up of me complaining every time I came home on Sunday night. And she said, look, either quit or shut up. I always get very good advice from my wife. So I started to write a blog in order to let out my feelings on a Monday morning, because it was quite distressing some of the time. It was quite stressful, and also there were a lot of funny situations too, and I wanted to give an idea through my writing what's actually going on inside a referee's head during a game at the amateur level. So I tried to be very honest in what the sometimes slanderous thoughts were that were going through my head as I was being chewed out by the parents or the coach or the players who had no idea about the rules of the game. And that ended up running for much longer than I expected. I thought it would maybe sort of after a year, maybe the stories would just start to repeat themselves. But every game seemed to have its own narrative and its own incidents, which sometimes I would just write about particular rules. Sometimes I would write about particular characters you meet on the field, archetypal characters, I suppose. And often it was just a recounting of the way things escalate without any kind of warning sometimes, and how you find yourself as a lone referee because they have no assistants, because there are just not enough people who are willing to do this fairly terrible job. And you suddenly find yourself alone trying to calm down as many as 60 or 70 people, including spectators and other interested parties. So I've written a book. The book is a compilation of the best entries from the blog, and I think it's gone down very well with a lot of refereeing colleagues I know who have been able to relate to the experiences in there. So it's published by a small company in the UK called Halcyon Publishing, and you can find them on the internet and buy a copy direct from them, which makes it much easier for an independent publisher to survive than if you buy it on Amazon.
Yeah. So, but you're also involved with Soccer America. Is that, and that's like an online?
Yeah, Soccer America has been going. It's America's, you probably know, America's longest running soccer publication. Has been going since the late 1960s in various forms, and it's now a pure, like most publications, is now purely online. So I've written. I used to write for them when I lived in the States, and now I've started a column there every week for the last I think 5.5 years. I've been writing now pretty much every week. They give me carte blanche to pontificate on whatever topic I feel like. So I tend to try and give American readers a point of view from Europe now, as I'm less in touch with the US soccer scene, and I give vent to my opinions there if anybody's interested.
Yeah, well, that's where I found you on your blog. So, but that kind of lured me in. But just talk a little bit about your background. You said you're Scottish. You lived in the States. Now you're living in Germany. So just talk a little bit about your personal connection with the game of football, or Americans call soccer. So
yeah, my parents are both from Scotland. I actually grew up in the east of England. They moved to England before I was born, and my local team play currently in the English third division, Lincoln City. I was watching them last night, actually live on television, thanks to the wonders of the internet. And that was a classic thing of going to the game with my dad when I was 6 years old, and falling in love with the whole stadium experience. And I played all through my school, university, my college years, and later in life, in my 30s, when I was living in the US, my daughters both became interested in soccer. I coached their teams and became a coach and a referee at the same time. And now I'm still involved as a referee in Germany, and I coach a girls team at my local club here in Frankfurt as well. We've actually been building up a girls. I was surprised actually when I came to Germany, given the prominence of the German women's national team, how few clubs actually ran girls teams. So the club I was became involved in as a coach, first of all, coaching boys teams. We put out an advert for tryouts for a girls team, and 30 girls came to the first session. So we now run 4 girls teams at the club, and which after having not a single team in the club for 70 years that was female. And my hope is that we can run a women's team there too at some point in a couple of years down the line.
Well, that's impressive, because I know in the States, like some of the girls teams mirror the boys teams. They're just as popular in population and also success. But I know I'm getting you late at night. You're over in Germany. I just want to leave you a couple points. But the 1966, that's the last time England won the World Cup. 60 years ago. What's the secret success, or what do you think has to happen for England kind of to because you think of football, you think of England, obviously you think of the big three, Germany, England, and France, but what's missing, or what's going on in England that they haven't it's been such a long drought?
I think they're probably closer now to having the kind of setup that would allow them to win the tournament than they have been for a long time. The problem for England after 1966 was that it was a tournament on home soil. It wasn't that great a tournament. They didn't have that great a team, but they played all the games at Wembley. They won. They thought, okay, we're the world champions. We invented the game. We've always been the best at this. We don't really need to do anything now. They didn't develop their game in the same way that Italy, Spain, Germany, all these countries had far more advanced coaching techniques. England just thought they could go out there with blood and guts and English heart and win just by virtue of being English. And that mentality lasted for decades, and partly fueled by the media, which also seemed to share this bizarre point of view that the English could win just by being English. I think now that with the advent of the Premier League and so many foreign coaches coming in to coach in that league, along with seeing different styles of play, different kinds of players, advances in diet, for example, and advances in coaching. The whole game in England has finally been professionalized thanks to that influence from the outside. Whereas back in my day, it was all about drinking and going on a tour to Mallorca at the end of the season, being out on the Raz and eating fish and chips before the game. That kind of thing was just. It's great to look back on now as a kind of nostalgia. But
but also I guess in American sports, I mean, they had that here, but also you want to kind of keep yourself in shape because there's so much more money to be made. There's a lot of money to be made out there for some of these players. So
exactly, the players cannot afford anymore to lead that kind of lifestyle. At that time, they could get away with it partly because everybody was doing it, but now you have to be at an extreme level of fitness. I mean, I think most of the players from the 1980s would very much struggle in today's game if they were thrown back into it. So I think England is another country that has a lot of really exciting young players, and I honestly wouldn't be that surprised if they go much further in this World Cup than they have previously.
Well, it's good to hear. What about venues, though? What do you think as far as what are some of the best? If somebody wants to go and visit some of these club teams, what do you think some of the best venues that you've been or that somebody has to go see, like and as far as football teams, either in the States or abroad? So
in England, I would say some of the best venues I go to are actually the smaller grounds in the lower leagues. You can find some fantastic soccer experiences that won't cost you the world if you go down into the third, fourth, and fifth divisions. Even when you found these little charming grounds in small towns that have crowds
Yeah.
of 300 or 400, there's something about that experience in England and in Germany as well. There's also this pyramid which takes you down to village level. And I've refereed in a lot of these small grounds in front of maybe 50, 100, 200 people. And it's actually, you feel like you really are at the grassroots of the game. And it's quite magical in many ways. If you want atmosphere, I would recommend German stadiums as a better bet than the Premier League, because the Premier League has become a little bit sanitized and overpriced, whereas in Germany you still have a very vibrant fan culture based around chants and singing and standing areas. I don't have much experience of going to games in Italy or Spain, so that's Scotland as well. I would say is another Glasgow. The Glasgow clubs, or also treat yourself to some places like Kilmarnock or Stirling, Dundee. Also, if it makes it for some fascinating trips and underside to football culture, soccer culture that you might not otherwise experience on television.
And then also, I mean, Ryan Reynolds and the other actor have that Wrexham series. It's quite popular. So that looks like a small, intimate town, small, intimate stadium. But I just want to leave it. But thanks, Ian. Thanks for staying awake over in Germany and speaking to me. But just so it'll, how do you the correct spelling of your or correct saying of your name? I don't want to butcher it. So,
my name Ian Plenderleith.
Plenderleith. Okay.
Yeah.
And what do you have coming up? What do you have? I know you have the book out. What else? You have anything else coming up? Or I guess you can watch it in Soccer America, just your blog. So.
Yeah, I'm working on a couple of book projects that are very much at the planning stage right now. So I'm going to see what's going to, if anything, will come out of those. Book publishing is a notoriously fallible industry, I think you could say. It's hard to know what the trends are going to be and who's going to be interested in whatever ideas you come up with. But will hopefully be something else in next year.
Well, thanks, Ian. I hope maybe one day have you come back on a show, maybe when the World Cup comes a little bit closer and things start picking up momentum. But I really appreciate you reaching out to me and speaking to me from Germany. It's really and just kind of opening a world that I think the U.S. is especially you're starting to learn about. But thank you and good luck with the book. So
it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me on the show.
All right. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Ian, for staying later in Germany. I'm wearing my Everton Langdon Donovan jersey. He hasn't been playing there, but still fits. So I figured it would be a good something to wear. Look for my next episode. We're going to get back to basketball in March. With baseball coming around the corner, I'm going to have a baseball episode. But like I said in the intro, some of the coaches and the writers and people that are involved in basketball with Martin Magis are preparing for that. So look forward to a couple of episodes coming up right around tournament time. And also kind of debriefing on what happened in the New Jersey State tournament, and some coaches, high school coaches, are agreed to come on. But with the season in full effect right now, at the end of February, they had other responsibilities. I respect that. Like, subscribe this episode. Also follow me on social media at Whalebones on X and on Instagram, and also on Facebook at Midlife Crisis Podcast. But thank you for your time. I hope you enjoyed this episode.